I was in my backyard pruning my azaleas and humming Frank Sinatra when the local code enforcement officer strolled up my driveway with all the solemnity of a funeral director. "Mr. Benson," he said, "you're being cited for noise pollution." I blinked. "Noise?" He pointed. "The wind chimes." I laughed, genuinely thinking this was a joke, but his face remained as stiff as my arthritic knees in December. That was complaint number 12 for that month alone. My crime, apparently, was daring to exist within a suburban zip code controlled by the iron fist of one woman. Her name? Karen. No, really, that was her actual name. And let me tell you, she earned every syllable of it. I'm George Benson, 68, retired high school history teacher, widower, lover of jazz, gardening, and exactly one glass of red wine with dinner. I've lived in my little craftsman home for 22 years, and for 21 of them, things were peaceful. Then Karen moved in next door, blonde bob, pearl earrings, and a personality like a cheese grater on sunburned skin. She introduced herself on day one with a smile that could curdle milk and said, "I just got elected to the HOA board, and I like things done right." Translation: your freedom ends where my yard begins. At first, I tried to be neighborly and brought over muffins. She told me she doesn't eat gluten and asked if my mailbox color was HOA-approved beige. I laughed. She didn't. From then on, it was war, but I didn't realize I was already under siege. The first complaint was about my unauthorized garden decor. That would be my vintage lawn gnome, Herman, who's been with me longer than most of my friends. Then came the attack on my bird feeder. "It attracts squirrels," she said, as if squirrels were rabid wolves. Then she called in a noise complaint on my wind chimes, which were a gift from my late wife. That one stung more than I let on. By the third month, I had received 17 official complaints. By the sixth, it was 37. 37 complaints about everything from visually offensive pumpkins to excessive friendliness of grandchildren. That's right. She tried to get my grandkids cited for loitering when they visited last summer. They were playing tag in my backyard. She claimed it was a public nuisance. I would have laughed if I wasn't so furious. I started keeping a log, a little black notebook where I documented every complaint with a date, time, and snarky annotation. June 12th, lawn gnome intimidation. Allegedly staring at Karen's petunias with malicious intent. It was my way of coping, turning rage into sarcasm. My poker buddies found it hilarious. One of them joked I should sell the story as a sitcom. Another said, "You should just sell your house to one of those haunted house companies. That'd give her something to complain about." That one stuck. It was a Sunday evening when the idea took root. I'd just been cited for having unsanctioned Halloween decorations in September. It was a little skeleton sitting in a rocking chair on my porch. My wife loved Halloween. She used to decorate the house like the Addams Family. I kept the tradition alive, partly for her, partly for the neighborhood kids. But Karen saw it as a violation of Article 14, Section 3 of the HOA guidelines. No decorations more than 30 days before a holiday. She walked up, clipboard in hand, and said, "This kind of clutter brings down property values." I looked at her deadpan and said, "So do your personality and that ferret you call a dog." That night, I poured myself an extra glass of wine and Googled haunted house companies that buy real homes. Turns out, they exist, mostly for pop-up attractions during Halloween season, but one in particular stood out, Phantom Estates, LLC. They specialized in converting charming older homes into permanent haunted experiences, and they were expanding. I filled out an inquiry form as a joke, chuckled to myself, and went to bed. By the next afternoon, I had a reply. The rep's name was Lila. She loved the photos of my house, especially the creaky staircase, wraparound porch, and overgrown garden, features I was constantly scolded for by Karen. She wanted to visit. I invited her over. The day Lila came, Karen was in her front yard, trimming her hedges with the same intensity most people reserve for diffusing bombs. Lila, dressed in all black with purple-tinted glasses, stepped out of her Prius and said, "This place is a gothic dream." Karen squinted at her like she just spotted a cockroach in stilettos. "Are you a realtor?" she asked. Lila grinned. "Something like that." Karen narrowed her eyes, then turned her back. That was her thing. Pretend not to care, then file a complaint under suspicious visitors. Lila and I walked through the house. She adored it, called it a ready-made horror narrative. When I mentioned Karen, she laughed for a full minute and said, "She's the perfect final boss. You'd be doing performance art." We drew up the initial paperwork that week. I negotiated one small condition. I wanted to stay involved, just during the setup, just long enough to see the look on Karen's face when she realized the HOA's crown jewel was becoming a year-round scare factory. I didn't tell anyone yet, not my poker buddies, not the mailman, not even Herman the gnome. I wanted the element of surprise. But I did start collecting Halloween supplies: skeletons, fog machines, LED lights, animatronic bats. Karen noticed. Of course she did. She asked, "Are you hosting a party?" I replied, "No, just embracing the neighborhood spirit." She actually shivered. By the end of the week, I had my official offer. The house would be sold in 90 days. Phantom Estates would begin work within 30, and Karen? She had no idea what was coming. Not yet, but she'd find out soon enough. I just hoped her clipboard could handle the shock. The morning after I signed the preliminary sale agreement with Phantom Estates, I made my usual cup of black coffee, sat on the porch with Herman the gnome standing loyally by my feet, and watched as Karen Power walked up the street with her dog, Biscuit, trotting beside her like an over-caffeinated rat. She paused at the edge of my lawn, sniffed the air like a bloodhound, and scribbled something onto her ever-present clipboard. I raised my mug to her in greeting. She didn't wave back, probably because she had just spotted the 3 massive boxes marked "Caution," theatrical fog machines, sitting on my porch. I whistled Sinatra as I dragged them inside, her glare burning 2 holes in the back of my head. Later that afternoon, Lila returned with 2 members of the Phantom Estates team, both in black jeans, combat boots, and carrying blueprints like we were planning a bank heist. We sat around my dining room table, sipping sweet tea and going over details. Lila pointed at the schematics with infectious excitement. "Here," she said, tapping my attic. "This becomes a seance room. The staircase? We add pressure-sensitive moaning floorboards. Your garden? Perfect spot for our motion-activated graveyard." I couldn't stop grinning. It was absurd, petty, and maybe a little unhinged, but it was also the most fun I'd had since Karen tried to call animal control on the robins nesting in my gutter. As we talked logistics, I realized I was actually enjoying this whole process, not just the revenge, but the creativity of it. For years, I had mowed the lawn to a precise, HOA-approved length, kept my house a mild shade of tan, and walked on eggshells around Karen's passive-aggressive commentary. Now, I was mapping out locations for pop-up coffins and hidden speakers that would whisper ghostly warnings every time someone opened the fridge. "Let's put a life-sized butler dummy right in the entryway," I said, "and give him a creepy catchphrase. Maybe something like, 'We've been expecting you,' but in a British accent." Lila clapped. "Yes, you're a natural." The next few days were a flurry of planning and secret deliveries. Every time a truck pulled into my driveway, Karen would march over to inspect it like a prison warden. One delivery guy asked if I was opening a party store. I winked and said, "Something like that." Karen filed 3 complaints in 2 days. One for noise, one for public nuisance, and one for disturbing the neighborhood aesthetic. That last one might have been about the 6-foot-tall inflatable ghost I'd parked in my living room window. The tipping point came when the team started testing the fog machines. It was a warm Thursday afternoon. I stood in my front yard with a remote in hand, pressed the button, and watched as thick, eerie mist began to billow out of the attic windows. Karen, who was weeding her flower bed in a suspiciously HOA-approved visor, screamed, not in terror, more like rage. She stormed across the lawn, coughing theatrically, and demanded to know what I was emitting into the atmosphere. I told her it was non-toxic fog, completely biodegradable, and certified by the Haunted Attractions Association. She didn't even blink, just pulled out her phone and called someone while glaring at me like I was releasing mustard gas. By the weekend, Phantom Estates had installed the first few attractions: a talking portrait above the fireplace, a mirror in the hallway that momentarily shows a ghostly reflection, and an animatronic cat that screeched every time someone walked past it, startling me more times than I care to admit. I'd taken to leaving the front door open while we worked, and a few curious neighborhood kids peeked in. I invited them inside and gave them a quick tour. One of them, a 10-year-old girl named Zoe, whispered, "This is the coolest house I've ever seen." That meant more to me than I expected. It reminded me of my own grandkids, who used to beg me for spooky stories at bedtime. Karen, naturally, spotted the kids and accused me of luring them in like some suburban Hansel and Gretel villain. I told her loudly enough for the parents down the block to hear. "They're guests, and I have full parental permission. You want to check their paperwork too?" Karen doubled down. She sent out a neighborhood email warning residents about a suspicious influx of supernatural-themed activity at 418 Oak Hill Lane. She referenced zoning laws, property ordinances, and claimed that my house was a menace to the moral fabric of the community. I replied all with a photo of my Halloween skeleton sipping tea on the porch, captioned, "Guess we're all boneheads now." The neighborhood was split. Some rallied behind Karen, citing property values and tradition. Others started calling my house the haunted home of Oak Hill and asked if I'd be selling tickets. Then came the city inspection. Karen had filed yet another formal complaint, and an actual city code inspector showed up unannounced. I invited him in, offered him a soda, and gave him the grand tour. To my surprise, he was a horror buff. He laughed at the animatronic ghost in the pantry, asked for Lila's card, and told me I wasn't breaking any rules as long as I wasn't charging admission yet. Karen nearly imploded when she saw him leaving my house, smiling and waving. I swear her little dog actually growled. At night, I sat on the porch and watched the subtle changes. More kids riding their bikes past my house, laughing and daring each other to peek in the windows. Teens snapping selfies with Herman, who now wore a tiny vampire cape. And Karen? She started avoiding me. No more accidental encounters, no more impromptu lectures about community standards. I think she realized something was changing, and not in her favor. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the fog curled around my porch steps like a ghostly blanket, Lila and I toasted with apple cider. "You've started a movement," she said. I chuckled. "Nah, I just wanted some peace and quiet." She looked around. "Well, you've got kids chanting ghost stories outside your mailbox, and a woman next door who looks like she's going to call an exorcist. So close enough." As the haunted house slowly came to life, so did I. It felt like breathing again, like I had wrestled control of my life back from the claws of conformity. I wasn't just getting revenge, I was reclaiming joy. And I had a feeling the best scares were still to come. The grand reveal was approaching, and my house no longer resembled the quiet, neutral little cottage that once blended into the suburban sea of beige. It now had personality, flavor, drama, a hint of darkness, and it was fabulous. I woke up each day to a new layer of transformation. One morning, I had a dusty attic. The next, it was a seance room with antique furniture and a flickering candelabra that moved ever so slightly when you weren't looking. The front yard, once a well-manicured showcase for my roses, had been overtaken by gravestones, skeletal hands clawing from the earth, and a crooked wooden sign that read, "Enter if you dare." I dared, enthusiastically. Karen, naturally, was losing her mind. The HOA had held 2 emergency meetings in the past week, one of which I attended just for the sheer joy of watching her twitch every time I smiled. She stood at the front, red-faced and flailing her clipboard like it was a sword, ranting about community standards, property values, and moral decay. I waited until she was finished and asked calmly, "Which part is more offensive to you, Karen? The graveyard or the fog?" A few neighbors chuckled. She glared at them like they'd betrayed the empire. Then she pointed directly at me and said, "He's turning our neighborhood into a circus attraction." I replied, "Correction, haunted attraction. Circuses don't usually have ghosts." Despite her hysteria, the HOA couldn't stop me. I wasn't violating any zoning laws. The haunted house wasn't a business yet, merely seasonal decor in preparation for private entertainment. Lila had helped me navigate every legal loophole. We even had documentation from the city permitting limited use of special effects, provided we kept it within acceptable hours. Karen tried to argue about the spirit of the rules, which was hilarious given we were literally installing spirits into every corner of the house. Word was spreading. Local teens started calling my place the Benson Boneyard. I overheard one of them say on a bike ride past, "I heard the hallway mirror shows you how you die." Another claimed the basement whispered your secrets. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just kept watering my lawn and saying, "Guess you'll have to find out." The mystery added fuel to the fire. Social media caught on. Someone posted a TikTok walking by the fog-covered yard at dusk, and it went viral locally overnight. I went from the old man with the gnome to Grandpa Ghoul. One of the neighborhood moms knocked on my door, sheepishly holding her daughter's hand. She said her kid wouldn't stop talking about the spooky house and asked if she could take a peek. I gave them a private tour. The little girl gasped when she saw the levitating tea set in the kitchen, part of a hidden wire rig Lila's team had installed. She giggled at the ghost in the pantry and asked if she could visit again. I nodded and said, "Anytime, kiddo." The mom mouthed a thank you as they left, and that moment filled a part of me I hadn't realized had been empty for a while. Not everyone was thrilled. A couple of Karen's inner circle neighbors followed her lead, writing passive-aggressive posts on the community board about respecting tradition and keeping the neighborhood wholesome. But I noticed something interesting. Most of the angry posts were anonymous. Meanwhile, the support was loud, proud, and growing. Families walked by in the evenings just to see what had changed. Kids dragged their parents toward the glowing porch. I started giving impromptu tours to small groups, using my best spooky voice and making up ghost stories on the fly. The laughter I heard from those kids, the way their eyes lit up, it was a sound I hadn't heard in years. It felt like a revival, not just of the house, but of me. Karen escalated. One night, she called the police, reporting a public disturbance and suspicious gatherings. 2 officers showed up, one young and one middle-aged, both clearly expecting a rowdy party. Instead, they found me in a smoking jacket, sipping cocoa in the seance room, and playing eerie music on a Bluetooth speaker. I greeted them cheerfully and offered them a tour. The younger one was fascinated and asked if we used animatronics or projection mapping. The older one smiled and said, "My daughter would love this place." They left 10 minutes later, laughing and taking selfies with the butler dummy in the foyer. Karen watched from her window, fuming like a cartoon villain. But beneath the humor, something deeper was building. I started thinking more often about my late wife, Eleanor. She was the creative spirit in our marriage, the one who turned our home into a wonderland each holiday season. Christmas, Halloween, even Arbor Day. She found joy in the whimsy. After she passed, I kept up the traditions in small ways, but the spark had dimmed. This haunted house project, it was like lighting a match in the dark. I felt closer to her with every cobweb, every spooky sound effect, every child's delighted scream. I even placed a photo of her in the seance room, framed in antique silver. Guests always asked who she was. I said, "She's the one who made this house feel alive." One evening during a particularly foggy dusk, I spotted Karen standing at the edge of my lawn again. She didn't say anything, just stood there, looking around, taking it all in. For a moment, I thought she might drop the act, maybe even say something kind. Instead, she turned and stomped away, her heels clicking like gunfire on the sidewalk. The next morning, I found a fresh complaint taped to my door. Unauthorized grave marker display. I laughed so hard I nearly fell down the porch steps. The preview night was approaching. Lila's team had everything ready. The effects were tested, the lighting was perfect, and the house practically breathed. We invited a small group of neighbors, local press, and of course, my poker buddies. The line stretched down the street with people chatting excitedly, some even wearing costumes. When Karen came storming out of her house to protest, she found herself outnumbered and ignored. One of the teens took her picture and whispered, "Boss level unlocked." Inside, the reactions were priceless. People screamed, laughed, clutched each other, and begged to go through again. I stood near the exit, watching their faces light up as they stepped outside, adrenaline pumping. Some shook my hand, others just nodded in awe. One woman teared up and said, "Thank you." This reminded me what it feels like to have fun. I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded, feeling my throat tighten. That night, long after the crowd had gone home, I sat in the seance room with Eleanor's photo and whispered, "We did it, hon." The candles flickered slightly, probably the AC. Or maybe not. Either way, I smiled because for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel lonely. It felt alive. The night Karen snapped was the night the butler dummy moved. Not by itself, of course, though I'm not entirely sure Karen would have believed otherwise. It was a particularly windy Friday night, with the fog machine going full tilt, casting long, dramatic tendrils of mist across the yard like ghostly fingers. The preview night had gone so well that Lila and I decided to leave some of the effects running for the weekend. No ticket sales, just ambience. The neighborhood was already buzzing about it anyway, and I was enjoying the attention more than I'd ever admit out loud. Karen, however, was unraveling faster than a ball of yarn in a kitten shelter. I saw her pacing from window to window in her living room, curtains fluttering every few seconds. She had been glaring across our property line for an hour straight. I suspected she was writing a strongly worded email to the HOA board, possibly to the mayor, and maybe even to whichever unlucky soul was in charge of the United Nations. I had underestimated just how deep her need for control ran. While I found the haunted house fun, she clearly saw it as an existential threat. I had turned my home into the very embodiment of everything she couldn't manage, predict, or suppress. And that, more than anything, was unforgivable. I was in bed by 11, half asleep, Sinatra crooning softly from the speaker on my nightstand, when I heard it. A creak, not one of mine. I know my house's groans better than my own bones. This was new, sharp, deliberate. I sat up, held my breath. Nothing. Then another sound. A click. My front door. Now, my door locks automatically when shut, and only two people besides me had keys, Lila and the code inspector. So, unless a raccoon had learned how to pick a deadbolt, something was off. I got up, grabbed the antique walking cane I never actually needed but kept for dramatic effect, and crept down the stairs. The fog machine was still puffing faintly through the floor vents, giving the house a light haze. As I turned the corner into the hallway, I saw a movement in the foyer, a shadow, hunched low, fiddling with the base of the butler dummy. I flicked on the lights, and the figure jumped, yelped, and smacked their head on the cabinet. It was Karen, dressed in all black, wearing gloves, and holding a screwdriver like she was auditioning for a villain role in a high school play. She froze. I froze. The butler dummy, which had been rigged to motion sensors, suddenly came to life and croaked in its creepy British accent. "I've been expecting you," Karen screamed. I didn't mean to laugh, but it came out before I could stop it, a full, hearty, chest-rattling laugh. She shrieked again and tried to bolt, but in her panic, she stepped on the corner of a fog machine cord and went sprawling across the entryway floor like a horror movie victim. I walked over slowly, cane clicking with each step, and said, "Karen, did you just break into my house to sabotage my fake butler?" She scrambled to her feet, hair wild, eyes full of fury and something else. Panic? Maybe shame, though she'd never admit it. "This is illegal," she spat. "This whole circus, this mockery of a home. You've turned this street into a nightmare." I leaned on my cane and replied, "Karen, if you wanted a private tour, all you had to do was ask." Her face twisted into something between a snarl and a sob, and without another word, she shoved past me, out the door, and vanished into the night. The next morning, I called the police, not to press charges, but to file a report just in case she tried to twist the story. To my surprise, the officer who arrived had already heard about the incident. Apparently, Karen had called them first, claiming she had discovered illicit activity and was acting in the interest of the neighborhood. When they heard my version and reviewed the security camera footage from my porch, they just shook their heads. "You want to press charges?" the officer asked. I thought about it for a moment. I really did. But then I looked at the screen, paused on a frame of Karen flailing mid-fall, and said, "No, I think she's already been haunted enough." Word spread fast. By noon, everyone knew what had happened. Karen breaking in, the scream, the fall, the butler's perfectly timed greeting. It became legend overnight. Teenagers started reenacting the scene in front of my yard. Someone even set the whole thing to dramatic music and uploaded it online. It went mini-viral in our town. A local podcaster messaged me asking for an interview. I said yes, mostly because I liked the sound of being called the haunted house hero. At the next HOA meeting, Karen tried to reclaim her position of authority, standing at the front with her usual clipboard and a presentation full of bullet points about restoring normalcy. But the room had shifted. The board members were polite but cold. One of them asked about the police report. Another mentioned how much their kids loved the house. When Karen tried to rally support, only one elderly neighbor half-heartedly nodded, and even he looked like he was doing it out of pity. Karen's grip had loosened, and everyone knew it. She didn't show her face much after that. A few days passed, then a week. Her car was still in the driveway, but the blinds stayed shut. I heard she was trying to get out of her HOA role quietly, a sort of slow-motion retreat from the throne. I didn't celebrate. Well, maybe a little. Okay, I might have installed a new fog machine aimed directly at her mailbox, but only because the angle looked cool at night. Then the twist came. I was on the porch, sipping cider and enjoying the peace, when a for sale sign appeared in Karen's front yard. Just like that. No fanfare, no flyers, no announcement. Just the silent white stake standing in her perfectly manicured lawn like a white flag. A neighbor confirmed it later that day. Karen was leaving, selling the house, moving to another neighborhood where things were, as she reportedly said, more civilized. I stared at that sign for a long time. I felt something, not exactly victory, not exactly sadness. Relief, maybe. The end of a war I never asked to fight. Then a thought crept in, an idea, a truly diabolical, absolutely ridiculous, and undeniably hilarious idea. I called Lila. By the time Karen's house officially hit the market, I'd already made my move. Phantom Estates submitted an offer discreetly through an alias company they often used for expansion projects, and I signed off on it personally. Because if I was going to be the ghost of this block, why not own both sides of the street? The house across the street was mine by the end of the month. Karen was gone, vanished like a puff of fog through the trees. And with her went the tension that had weighed over the neighborhood like a soggy wool blanket. The day the moving truck pulled away, I stood at my window with a steaming mug of coffee, watching silently as her last box was shoved into the back. For a moment, I wondered if she'd turn around, one final glare, one parting shot. But she didn't. She never looked back, just climbed into her car and disappeared down the hill. The silence she left behind was beautiful, almost sacred. With Phantom Estates now owning both properties, the possibilities doubled. The original house continued as the heart of the haunted experience, full of charm, character, and carefully orchestrated scares. But the house across the street, Karen's old temple of order and vanilla uniformity, that was going to be something different. That one, we turned into an escape room. A haunted escape room. Lila and I brainstormed ideas over wine and leftover Halloween candy. It should feel like you're trying to get out of a cursed suburban nightmare, she said. I laughed until I choked on a peanut butter cup and said, what better inspiration than the Queen of Petty herself? We kept the exterior mostly the same, clean lines, trimmed hedges, shutters perfectly aligned. But inside, it was another world. Rooms full of coded messages, creepy artifacts, haunted family photos with shifting eyes, and sound effects that whispered your name when the lights went out. We built a narrative around a fictional HOA dictator who vanished under mysterious circumstances. The player's goal: escape the house before they too were swallowed by the bylaws. It was gloriously over the top and deeply satisfying. The first test run was with my poker buddies, who were equal parts terrified and delighted. Jerry got so spooked by a hidden speaker in the bathroom that he refused to use the toilet for the rest of the night. Hank spent 20 minutes arguing with a skeleton about clue logic. Frank accused me of rigging the final puzzle just to mess with him. He wasn't wrong. They all laughed until they couldn't breathe and immediately begged to go through again. That was when I knew we had something special. A year passed like a gust of wind through dry leaves. The haunted house, now officially known as the Benson Boneyard, became a staple of the town. We opened seasonally at first, but demand grew so fast we expanded to holidays. Valentine's Day had haunted love letters and creepy cupids. Easter featured zombie bunnies and a fog-covered egg hunt. I even did a spooky version of the 4th of July where the haunted butler gave dramatic readings of the Declaration of Independence in a candlelit room. People ate it up. And best of all, the neighborhood didn't just tolerate it, they embraced it. Kids from the block started volunteering, helping with decorations, learning makeup effects, and sneaking extra candy during breaks. Teenagers once too cool to wave at the old man with the gnome now treated me like some kind of local legend. One even asked me to sign their prop machete. Parents thanked me for giving their kids something creative and safe to do. Even the remaining HOA board members warmed up. Turns out, people liked fun more than rules. Go figure. One day, I caught a glimpse of Zoe, the little girl who had once whispered that my house was the coolest she'd ever seen. She was now a few inches taller, wearing face paint, and helping guide a group of younger kids through the attraction. She smiled at me as she passed and said, "You know, this place kind of feels like home now." I didn't say anything, just smiled and nodded, because she wasn't wrong. I kept Eleanor's photo in the seance room. It became part of the attraction in a subtle way. Some guests thought she was part of the story, a lost spirit, a former owner, a guiding soul. In a way, they weren't wrong. I talked to her sometimes, late at night after the fog cleared and the lights dimmed. I'd tell her about the day, the people, the laughter. I'd imagine her laughing with me, rolling her eyes at the ridiculousness of it all, proud of the chaos I'd unleashed in her honor. Then one crisp autumn afternoon, a black SUV pulled up across the street. A woman stepped out, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand. For a moment, my heart stopped. Karen? No, just a realtor. But it stirred something in me. I realized we'd gone a whole year without her, and the block had never felt lighter. Still, I wasn't naive. Some Karens don't vanish. They respawn in other forms. Sure enough, a few days later, I saw her, Karen, back in town for what she claimed was a quick visit. She parked by the curb and walked slowly toward my yard, eyeing the decorations with thinly veiled disgust. She stopped in front of Herman, who now wore a tattered wizard hat and held a tiny sign that said, "No Karens allowed." She huffed. I stepped outside, cane in one hand, cup of cider in the other. "Back for a tour?" I asked casually. She didn't respond right away, just stared at me with a cocktail of rage, regret, and residual embarrassment. Finally, she said, "You ruined this neighborhood." I sipped my cider. "Funny, everyone else seems to think I saved it." She shook her head and turned to go. I let her walk away, not with triumph, but with a strange mix of pity and peace. The war was over. She had lost. And more importantly, I had won without becoming anything like her. That night, the kids set up a surprise for me. They built a miniature version of the original haunted house in the front yard, complete with tiny gravestones, blinking lights, and even a toy version of the butler. They called it the house that haunted the HOA. I laughed so hard I nearly pulled a muscle. As we all stood there under the stars, someone handed me a small plaque they'd made from wood and foil. It read, "In honor of George Benson, Scare Master, Community Hero, Grandpa Ghoul." I held it in my hands, speechless. Later, I visited Eleanor's grave, the plaque tucked under my arm. I placed a tiny pumpkin next to her headstone and whispered, "Told you I'd make him laugh." A soft wind stirred the leaves. Probably coincidence. Maybe something more. I didn't care. I felt her with me. When I returned home, the porch was full of neighborhood kids waiting for another ghost story. I sat down in my chair, fog machine puffing at my feet, and began with the line they all loved. Once upon a time, there was a woman named Karen who filed 37 complaints about a house, and that's when the haunting began. They screamed with delight, and in that moment, surrounded by laughter and flickering lights, I realized I hadn't just won a battle. I'd built a legacy, one scare at a time.